I'm an entrepreneur. I started a company called Zen Chef at the end of my studies, which was originally a student project, and today, 14 years later, has become a leader in Europe. So it's been a year now since I left my operational role. For me, it seems obvious, kind of like a eureka moment. So I see an opportunity, and that's enough for me. I don't go much further into market research before saying, let's go. Every day, we receive messages from customers telling us, this is great. It changed my life.
Welcome to The Choice, the show where we examine the choices and decisions of our guests. On one hand, because we're trying to understand the decisions that allowed our guests to have the exceptional paths they've taken. Today, we're with Xavier Zeitoun, co-founder of ZenChef. ZenChef is a brand that everyone knows, that everyone uses to book their restaurant reservations. Hello, Xavier.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure. Um, and the second reason we're interested in decisions, in the way we choose, is because we're convinced that in the age of AI, with AI performing more and more tasks, tomorrow, maybe even with robots entering the physical world, to also perform tasks in the physical world, we're seeing a shift from a world where the biggest differentiator was the ability to execute. They used to say that having an idea had little value. In fact, you had to be able to follow through on that idea and execute it. And we think that's changing. That with AI, execution is becoming easier and easier, accessible to everyone. But on the other hand, as a result, what's left for humans is to decide, to make intentional choices. And that is going to more and more. Set humans apart. It's their ability to make a choice. I'm also here with Anne Claire, CTO of Joopy, who builds tools to help Joopy users make decisions in business, in groups, and in their personal lives. Hello, Anne Claire.
Hello.
Xavier, we're going to look at some decisions you've made, some choices, and try to understand them. What led you to have this spectacular trajectory? But maybe so that those listening can get a sense of the scale of what you've done, could you tell us about ZenChef? Give us a few figures.
Yeah, of course. Well, maybe first, just quickly about me. So I'm 39 years old. I have two kids, aged 2 and 4. There you go. I'm married. I live in Paris. And indeed, I've been an entrepreneur for 14 years now, since I started a company called Zen Chef toward the end of my studies, and which was ultimately a student project that turned into a company for restaurant reservations with professional software for restaurant owners, and which today, 14 years later, has become a leader in Europe with over 30,000 restaurant owners using it daily. All over Europe, millions of people booking every day in restaurants, and a team across Europe of over 500 people. So there you have it, a company that has reached a fairly mature size.
How many acquisitions have you made recently?
We've completed 4 acquisitions in total. One to add a product component, so with payment, and then others to expand into other European markets with acquisitions of direct competitors.
You've established a dominance over this reservation space. As I was saying earlier, I personally find it spectacular. And even more so because you had a huge competitor. And when you started, there was someone already established. And they weren't from the old economy. They were already a new economy startup that had set up shop there.
Yeah. Well, what you should know is that we started with a product that wasn't for reservations. It was a platform for consumers to find restaurants, but not to actually book them. And then one day we told ourselves that we had to move toward reservations. And our first instinct was to go see La Fourchette, which was the legacy player, the leader in France, and propose using their technology as a white label. And they denied us that access. And it's thanks to that refusal that ZenChef became what it is today. Because we decided, though we didn't really have a choice, to create our own competing technology. Even though originally we just wanted to resell a Fourchette as a white label.
So you've succeeded all over Europe and maybe in other regions tomorrow to do something, to establish a dominance. In any case, there were competitors. So to me, that's truly exceptional. And so today, we're going to try to understand the choices that allowed you to have this trajectory.
I hope so. Let's go.
I hope it can inspire other people. And that's the goal. So, first decision 14 years ago in an ecosystem that didn't actually exist. The tech ecosystem in Paris didn't exist. And you decide to go and start a company. And so, to be precise, I'm thinking of the day you actually went to start the company. You filled out a form. I imagine you had to write a check for €1 or maybe bring in a bit more capital. So, it's still a decisive moment in the sense that it's not trivial. It doesn't take 5 seconds. There's necessarily some reflection. And so, I'd like to ask you if you remember what your state of mind was and why you decided to go and incorporate a company to create a structure. What was behind that decision?
Well, we'd already been working for a year with my cousin, who became my partner on this project. We didn't need to have a legal entity to develop it since we were doing it with our own resources. And there was nothing forcing us to make any official or administrative declarations. And then when we finished developing the first version of our product and were ready to launch it, that's when we thought maybe, if we're lucky, we'll have to invoice and make money. And then we'd need a structure. And so I remember very well that day when I went to the Nanterre registry on my scooter to file the papers to register the company. And it's true that it's a very symbolic day that I think you remember your whole life when you're an entrepreneur.
And so that day you went to make that declaration and you didn't have any clients, you didn't need to invoice, but you said to yourself, I'm going to go, I'm starting a company. That's it. I'm a business owner.
When you start a company, you hope to make money. You hope to generate some revenue. So, when you have at least some confidence in your ability to do it, well, you take that step.
So, if I understand correctly, in the preceding year, as part of an internship, you had declared that you were in the process of starting a company at your school. And after a year of doing that, at some point you said, we're really going to do this. And so to make it official, I'm starting a business.
Yeah. Yeah, beyond the administrative side, I think there's a strong symbolism in the way you commit to the project for good. It means we're going to do it for real. It's no longer a student project. It's not just for fun in the evenings anymore. It's something we're going to be serious about. We're going to do it.
And so you give up on looking for a job. You're no longer a student at that point, and you tell yourself, this is my life now. I'm going to try to find clients and be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and actually, there's a whole process to get to that day. I've always created projects. I started my first business when I was 15. I've always developed digital tools. Anyway, I've been immersed in that world even if I hadn't really been an entrepreneur for long, which means I never considered doing anything else. And so I took the first excuse, which was this student project, to tell myself, let's go. But
It was obvious.
it was obvious. And besides, I was 24. I was living with my parents. I had no expenses, no responsibilities. So, in fact, the risk taking was quite limited. Yes, not taking a job, not starting a career. But actually, I always told myself that starting a company would be an incredible experience. And at worst, if I ever had to apply for a job later, I could leverage it. So I don't think it was a decision with as many potential consequences as someone who already has a family, a career, a loan, and so on.
So there's the decision to start a company, and then there's the decision of what project to do. That decision, I imagine you faced it at the beginning of your student project. What did you start with, and how did the theme of the project come about?
Yeah, well, I think it's like meeting someone in life and a relationship. You first have to want it. So I'd wanted to be an entrepreneur for a long time. And then one day during my studies, I went to the States, lived in New York for a year for an internship. Not at all in digital, nothing to do with it. But as a consumer, I discovered platforms that help restaurant owners get online visibility and consumers find restaurants. And it was the early days of mobile, so all that was changing rapidly and moving onto mobile. And when I got back to Paris after that famous internship, I discovered there was nothing in France. And so for me, it seemed obvious, a bit of a eureka moment where I said to myself, it's just not possible that in the country most famous in the world for its gastronomy, with so many restaurants, we're so far behind. So I see an opportunity, and that's enough for me. I don't need much more market research to tell myself, let's go for it.
And so, what did "let's go for it" mean at that time?
Well, it meant going to see the person I spent the most time with back then, who was my cousin. Because we played video games in the evening, we really liked spending time together. So I said, hey, do you want to think about this project together? So at first, it was like a game. In the evenings, we worked together. He, for his part, was an employee, so he was busy during the day. And then we thought, let's see what angle would be interesting. And then we realized we could take all the restaurant menus that are on physical media and digitize them, put them into a database, and then allow people to search by dish. I mean, we imagined all sorts of things. We were going in every direction. And actually, we were having a blast doing it. And that was it.
Would you have started the company if it hadn't been for your cousin, that relationship with your cousin?
It's hard to know in hindsight if,
It's not very nice to him to say yes, you know?
no, but actually, it was just obvious at the time. So maybe, well, honestly, I couldn't tell you.
In any case, I think it was very foundational for you to have been with him. I think you once told me that one of the main drivers was just to spend time with your cousin.
Yeah. Then again, I think, even in hindsight, that if you're alone, there are many moments in your journey where you're in that phase that's a bit where you haven't really launched your business yet, but you're still thinking about it, where you can find 1,000 good reasons not to do it because you talk about it and people say, no, there's too much competition, it won't work, and so on. Or you realize yourself that it's going to be harder than expected. And actually, that's the moment when, if there are two or three of you, well, one of you can say, no, no, actually,
The emulation, the energy.
let's go. So I think it's in that sense. Maybe the project wouldn't have seen the light of day without him.
So you're saying that maybe when you make decisions together, you can make slightly more courageous decisions? Either courageous or aiming a bit further. Well, in this case, do you feel like you ultimately made a joint decision with your cousin to move forward? Or did you have to influence his decision a bit, like convince him to?
Absolutely. And what's more, what was even more of a driver was that he was an employee for the first 6 months of the company. And so he only did it in the evenings and on weekends. And then at some point, the question arose, well, are you going to join the project full time? Which meant for him leaving a well paying job with a family. He already had a first child at the time, was married, and so on. So he had to face that choice with significant responsibilities,
Unlike you, then.
unlike me. And it was me who, for my part, had to motivate him by saying, but actually, you have nothing to lose. At worst, you have 18 months of unemployment. You'll find a job afterwards. So it's okay. Come on, let's do it. You'll regret it if you don't. And he was hesitant, obviously, because there were significant consequences. And finally, I pushed him to do it. I had to force him a bit. And afterwards, he was very happy to have taken the plunge.
Well, it's not said enough, but I think the unemployment system we have in France and the safety net provided by the French social system really helps with business creation because it encourages risk taking when you know that you actually have a way to land on your feet, which are offered by the system we have in France. And I'm not sure we're fully aware of it in France, but it's still a major accelerator for entrepreneurship. So that's one example.
They say that the biggest business angel in France.
Is the unemployment office, France Travail now. And so you think that for him, it played a role in his ability, even though he had a family and all, to take that risk. And so ultimately, the fact that Zenchef exists today is a consequence of that system.
And then, well, yes, there are 18 months, but there are only 18 months to take your company from 0 to 1 and get those first clients. So it also sets a deadline. For me, maybe by living with my parents, I could have coasted longer. I would have felt less pressure to immediately make money and generate revenue. Whereas the fact that he had that pressure, I think it was positive because there was no choice. It was either we make it in 18 months or, well, we'd each do something else.
So to recap a bit, you've always had this intuition that you wanted to be an entrepreneur. You'd started entrepreneurial projects, by the way, in the world of restaurants, nightlife, and so on. I think you'd organize student parties or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. There was a website that listed parties, photos, and so on.
Okay.
Before Facebook.
So you had that entrepreneurial side in you. You saw technologies in New York that inspired you, and you thought, we can apply this in France. So you had that desire, the opportunity arose, and then the partnership with your cousin, someone you want to spend time with, and the incentives that made it possible. Are we missing anything here, or would you say that's what drove the decision?
Yeah, that's it, exactly. But at the time, it was much more organic. I mean, it just happened.
Of course.
It happened naturally, okay?
Do you think we're post rationalizing things a bit here, and that at the time, you actually felt like you were making a major decision?
Not at all. You see, that's why I say that. At the time, I didn't feel at all like I was saying I'm heading down this path in life or that it was a choice that would define everything.
You did it lightheartedly.
Yeah,
Obliviousness?
yeah, you need some.
No, it's true that at first, I think when you start a company at 25, between 25 and 30, there's a kind of spontaneity and probably an obliviousness to the difficulties that will inevitably arise. But that helps you because if you really knew the risks,
If you knew,
Exactly.
very clear. If we look at things today, I know we'll talk more about what happened in the meantime, but I think it's interesting to mirror the two situations. Today, you're no longer operational at Sen Chef and have been for a while. And I know you're looking at opportunities to start a new company, to create a new business. I imagine it's a radically different situation compared to the first time based on everything we just summarized. In fact, today, on each of these points, you're in the opposite situation.
Completely. One, I know what it takes to start a company. I know it's at least a 10-year commitment. Two, I'm thinking with much more structure about the next project. I immediately see the potential obstacles. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. But in any case, there's less spontaneity. And at the same time, I have all this background, all this experience, this network, which are also strengths, giving me confidence that things will move faster the next time around. So, yes, it's a totally different experience.
For example, I imagine if you were in the same situation as 14 years ago and you look at a market and see a competitor as established as the fork was back then, I imagine that today it's a no-go. You tell yourself, someone is already that established, I can't go there.
Probably. And that's where it's not necessarily a strength. At some point, I think you need a trigger similar to the one I had back then for different reasons, but that sense of recklessness that makes me take the plunge, despite all the rational arguments telling me not to, like having a very strong competitor in that market.
And then succeeding by accident, overcoming an obstacle you hadn't seen.
Exactly.
potentially, that trigger would need to be a bit stronger today. But do you already have some options? I don't know, certain fields you're looking at?
It's been a year since I left my operational role, and so after that, I took a break, enjoying my family, going on trips. And since I've been back, I've really been looking at projects. And what I was able to see on one project is that I had a spark in me that could reignite very quickly. And in the end, I didn't move forward with that project because I also saw things I didn't like. But in any case, I see there's still something that is indeed irrational, like an inner fire that can relight very fast. Too fast? Remember,
I remember seeing you a few weeks ago and you told me, yeah, I had an idea yesterday. I know I'm going to start this for sure. And I think the very next day you changed your mind.
yeah,
So you're very enthusiastic thing,
yeah. But that, I think, is exactly that slightly reckless side.
but you need it.
Still there?
If you think too much, you do nothing.
Right, exactly. And so I know that when the time comes, when I have a truly strong conviction, I'll also have that little irrational spark to make me take the leap.
Is it harder today to find an idea? Compared to 15 years ago, the environment has changed a lot.
Personally, I think it's easier. I think ideas always revolve around the same topics, and we're mostly reinventing how they're used. But it's rare to see true innovation in the sense of creating something that's never existed before. So often we think about how to do things better with a new paradigm, with new technologies, with new ways of doing things, new business models. And so, in that sense, I think there are as many ideas, maybe even more, than there were 15 years ago. You just have to dig into subjects, look at the problems, have an approach.
But 15 years ago, there was a lot of greenfield, of spaces to conquer. There was nothing, at least in the digital space, and you had to go in and set something up. Aren't we in an ecosystem today where a lot of, in the end, human needs, there's transportation, obviously, food, leisure, entertainment. Then there's productivity, there's payments, and then, well, actually, there's a certain number of verticals, but that number's finite. And after that, we can invent new things.
Yes, there are. There are new products, though. I mean, I don't know, but for example, well, Musk creating satellites. I mean, there's still disruptive innovation. I think that's still possible today.
Yeah, with technology. So that's the question. And so there's a whole set of verticals that are already, they're already players with technology. Take an example, when we talked about mobile, at one point we were talking about CRM for mobile. Well, in the end, it was Salesforce, the mobile CRM. Then there was Uber, which disrupted taxis, Airbnb, which disrupted booking. But I think, well, when you look at the stock price, actually Booking did. It was also Booking that disrupted Booking itself and did quite well. And so I don't know if actually today, when we look at these verticals, I still get the impression that it's very crowded. So then you have to be creative and say, how do you see it?
Yeah. I think that, as the saying goes, we overestimate what we're capable of doing in 3 years, and we underestimate what we're capable of doing in 10 years. And most of the companies that are on the NASDAQ today, which are the most highly valued in the tech world, I think most of them didn't exist 30 years ago.
30 years ago.
There. So 30 years isn't much. And yet there were use cases. What I mean is the companies doing CRM, doing mobility, there were other forms that matched the possibilities of the time. And now we're entering a new era with artificial intelligence, with robotization. And so I think it's in that sense that there are a huge number of opportunities being created.
Yeah. So, okay. So on one hand, we're saying verticals that already existed. Well, in those verticals, there are already tech companies that exist, but we think that maybe with AI, we can outpace them or execute better. But even people creating in AI, there are a lot of them. And as soon as we think of an idea, a new vertical, we look, oh, I have a great idea. I've never seen that. It doesn't exist. And then you do a search. And the other day, we were talking about companies that do simulations in the sense of market research simulations. For example, by simulating consumers with agents to try to do predictive surveys on whether a name, a logo, or an idea will be well received. And actually, you do a search, and there are 30 funded startups that launched into that 2 years ago. It's already a red ocean, meaning that even among those 30, in fact, they're all identical. You look at the websites, they've all become standardized. They all have, one is Andreessen, the other is Sequoia, and so on. So how, in that environment, how can you think about finding an idea and tell yourself, this idea is going to be I'm going to have a place where I can execute, differentiate myself, and build a business?
Yeah, well, first, I think the nature of technological disruption means that a lot of people rush into the opportunity. And it's nothing new. There were a lot of people who rushed into search, into e commerce, and that's normal. It's a process, I think, that repeats itself, that there's a lot of capital invested to take risks. As a result, there are a lot of companies doing the same thing. And in the end, in 10 years, we'll know who the winners are.
And you and I, when we started 15 years ago, like we were saying earlier, there was nothing in Paris. There weren't people creating startups. There were very few. They were all still going into consulting or finance. And so we built Stardutch. And we've known each other since we both did that 15 years ago. Very few of us did it in that generation. And we made a lot of mistakes along the way. But it didn't matter because there weren't many of us. We were there first. And having that intention and that direction is what allowed us to succeed. It wasn't the execution. The execution was average, but we were determined, differentiated, and so on. But today, that's no longer. You think, well, I can't say I'm all alone. And then I have a hypothesis. That means at least, thanks to this hypothesis, I don't have to work harder than everyone else or be better funded. I mean, today you feel like to succeed, you have to, work harder, be better funded, have a better network. You need to have an advantage in every single area. Because otherwise, you're never going to make it.
Indeed, I think if you go into this current AI race on the most critical topics of the moment, well, there's a level of competition that's never existed. Exactly. Everyone is very well funded. Everyone is excellent. Everyone works incredibly hard. So it's very difficult. But that's not all for a start. There's still the rest of the industry where there's an enormous amount to be done. And there's innovation to be brought, even if it's not necessarily disruptive innovation with artificial intelligence. And then on the other hand, in the opportunities that AI will create, I think if we consider what developed the leisure and travel industry that didn't exist, I don't want to say anything wrong, but maybe 50 years ago, it was paid leave. It's the productivity that increased in companies and allowed for the creation of paid leave. And that eventually allowed people to start traveling. And so I think that often people are afraid of productivity increasing so drastically right now with artificial intelligence and therefore jobs that will disappear. And there surely will be. But I think there will be 10 times more jobs created in industries to go back to underestimating what will exist in 10 years, industries we can't even imagine today.
So you're saying society is changing. You see, when you mention paid leave, it's about societal changes, and these changes create moments of major shifts. And within these shifts and new behaviors and new needs, that's where you can anticipate. So, do you have any examples? Because when you tell us that, we want to say, okay, so what's going to happen that creates opportunities to,
Well, I don't know exactly what will happen, but I think people will work less. We'll work less in companies because, as you said, the execution of tasks will be carried out largely by intelligence, by artificial intelligence, by agents, and tomorrow, even by robots in the physical world. So I see this trend, and it's hard to know how long it'll take for humans to get their time back. And so, what that time will consist of, how it will be used, excuse me, well, I think there will be more and more leisure. I think the video game industry is growing tremendously, the entertainment industry too, the social media industry, the time we spend online, not working, but entertaining ourselves. So I see all these industries developing rapidly, and even tourism, leisure in general. Everything that will benefit from the fact that we'll work less and that companies will be more productive.
And so the question for you is, how fast is this going to be? Because if you're in the mindset of, well, starting a company in a field, there's a question of, okay, when will the market actually emerge?
Yeah. And again, I'm not at all worried about the ability, mine or that of entrepreneurs, in general, in the era we live in, to find opportunities and businesses to create. In Japanese, they say the same word for problem and opportunity. And really, what is being an entrepreneur? It's simply identifying a problem that you can empathize with, either because you experience it yourself or because you've seen it in your company, your circle, or your family, and you decide to solve it. And ultimately, technology is just the means to get there. But problems are not what's missing. In fact, there's a tendency for there to be more and more of them. And so, for every problem, there can be a company created to solve it. So, entrepreneurship isn't that complicated, actually.
And what makes a problem for you? You say there are many, and many that you could take on and address. So, what makes a problem the right problem for you?
Well, exactly. I think that when you've already seen the movie once, when you've lived through all the stages of the entrepreneurial cycle, from creation to fundraising, difficulties, and restructuring, because that's the truth, and then often we only remember the end, which is the success. In 0.1% of cases, and in the success that only concerns 0.1% of companies, we only remember what worked, when in reality, when you look at the biggest successes, it was a series of failures. And then there was a bit of luck and persistence that made it work in the end. So I don't remember why I was saying that. It's
What's going to make this problem the right one for you?
actually, for me, the only difference between a good entrepreneur and a bad entrepreneur is doing one more day. And so doing one more day means really wanting to keep working on that project despite all the difficulties, all the personal sacrifices it involves, and so being there just a bit longer. And so to get there, you have to really want to work on that project. It means developing a great empathy, either for a sector of activity, the people affected by the problem we're solving, the product we've developed, and telling yourself that actually, no, all these headwinds, you want to wake up one more morning and do it.
So, the first time around, you had a huge appetite for the subject when you started Zen Chef 15 years ago. There was a lot of recklessness. You didn't see the difficulties, the competition, and so on. And it was a blue ocean. There was no one else there. Today, it's the complete opposite. You understand, you see the spaces, you see the difficulties. There's a very high level of competition. But you say, in the end, it doesn't matter because the way I make decisions today is more informed. I see all these options and I'm not running out of them because there are new technologies and societal changes. I look at all that and I see plenty of problems. And once you have that, how are you going to, I imagine you haven't done it yet, but how will you narrow it down later to say, okay, do you look at them one by one? Or do you at some point say, I'll take notes and then I'll have 10 candidates and I'll choose one of these companies and start it? You see, 15 years ago, you chose because your cousin was there and you convinced him. A meeting that makes you, how do you choose from all these options?
Look, I've had a small side business as an investor for a few years now, and I realized that those who quit the fastest were often consultants who had switched to entrepreneurship and had that bias of looking at all sectors, scanning them, seeing an opportunity, and going for it because they want to be entrepreneurs, but they aren't passionate about the subject. And after 2 or 3 years, like in any company, the first difficulties arise and they quit because they can get paid very well by going back to their consulting careers. And so they don't want to do it. It was fun to raise funds, to do it, to be an entrepreneur for a few years. Entrepreneur. And so I'm not at all in a structured thinking process, looking at markets, having a methodology to filter them, and then digging deeper or not. I'm more in the mindset of someone who would like to meet their soulmate. But honestly, the absolute worst way to meet them is to put a ton of pressure on yourself and try to go on like 10 different dates every single night. And to go,
On a dating app, but everyone does that nowadays, so
no, no, no.
that's how it is.
And besides, I'm not sure it works, but anyway, whatever. So I'm more in a serendipity approach, telling myself I'm not going to put pressure on myself. I'm going to meet people, explore subjects, open my mind after being 100% focused with blinders on for 15 years.
So no pressure and you're waiting for a spark. That's what you're saying.
You need passion to keep going for years. And so ultimately, the decision making lens for me, it should be first and foremost something that comes from the heart more than something that comes from the head. And then once there's that passion that develops for a subject, obviously you have to dig into it. And if it's not a good idea, if the market is too small, there are some pretty pragmatic criteria that you also have to use.
But the problem with those criteria is that if you really apply them, you eliminate everything.
Yeah, but if you have passion as a foundation, I think that
Move on.
it'll be the same as back then. Right, I wouldn't look too much. I'd say, let's go and then we'll see.
And you call your company 1001 Menus again.
Of course,
That was quite a name.
360 learning, 360 learning.
But we stayed loyal to that name while you renamed yours Zen Chef.
Yeah. Look, the name in entrepreneurship and in B2B is a
It's tough.
subject of little importance. We value it too much.
Oh, really?
No, but
Oh, I don't think so. I think the brand, I wonder, for example, if Zoom, they didn't win during COVID just because they were called Zoom as opposed to WebEx or, names that were less. Zoom was very. So we'll do a Zoom, everyone said. A lot of people discovered these tools during COVID. And I think that even in B2B, in any case, maybe you think it doesn't matter. Nevertheless, you still rebranded 1001 Menus to Zen Chef. Do you think there would have been the same success if it had been called If you had stayed,
Yes, for us, there was a subject that was a problem expressed by our clients who didn't understand what we did. They thought we were doing recipes.
because you pivoted from the milieu.
Exactly. So it's just that we had a name that didn't fit. On the other hand, just changing names for cosmetics, well, there are plenty of cases where I think it's not useful. But
There's the memorability of the name.
yeah, but in the end, what people remember are the values. Behind the company, it's the product, it's the people. And so they associate, there are plenty of brands that are lousy on paper. I don't know, I'm thinking of Haagen-Dazs or things like that everyone ultimately remembers.
I don't know, Haagen-Dazs? I think it gives an idea of cold. You see there the umlauts, etc. And so I think they're ice creams. They come from the north, Haagen-Dazs, the Vikings, I don't know. I think it helps create an imagery that matches the product. Well, it's easy to say.
It's a bit post-rationalist.
Yeah, it's easy to say in retrospect. Okay, it wasn't.
We could spend 2 hours on rebranding it.
It's about the choice. It's the decision on the name Zen Chef.
But I think it's a real subject. And I think there are companies that succeed solely on the name and three little things around the name. And I think that can make you succeed. Then maybe what you're saying is in B2B, the purchase decision's often rational. And it's true that even if you don't have a good brand, you can probably find other ways to succeed. So maybe it's not what makes you fail, but I think it can make you succeed. It can give you a 5 times boost in acceleration. But okay, that's not our subject today. Uh, we have on AI, we have before closing on the subject of starting a business in 2025 versus in 2010, we touched a bit on the subject of AI. But for me, it's true that when I look at the topics today, similarly, like you, I'm a bit of a business angel. I see small files come across my desk. We talk with friends who are starting companies, and often AI is central today because it's the change. It's a good reason to say when you create a project today, why this project today? Well, because there's a shift with AI and it changes something. And so I'm using AI in my project. So that's pretty much everyone today. And I find that regularly, in fact. A question I'll end up asking myself is, what is the vision for a societal benefit that this company brings? And I fail to find it. And that bothers me because I think one of the reasons to succeed is that you tell yourself, I'm going to improve society. So we talk a lot about changing the world, and it's in the Y Combinator playbook. The entrepreneur wants to change the world, but it's a bit naive. But there's still this idea, which I think is a good one. First principle, that if you improve the world and you put yourself in the right place, you'll capture some of the value of that improvement. And so that's a reason why you're going to succeed. But with AI, we had a project with the internet, which was that the internet would connect people and we'd be connected, so we'd be better. There's something of a popular revolution since we'll finally be connected, so we'll have power to the people. There's a side like that. But with AI, I don't know what the project is. Somewhat societal. And I think that shows in all the pitches where I know you and I were talking about workflow companies saying we're going to improve, I don't know, some HR process and whatnot. And you think, but are we going to improve it? Are we going to automate it? Is the world better afterwards? So do you see today, on the one hand, is it a driver in your decision to say, yeah, I'm going to change the world. We're in a particular world. So even saying today, I'm going to make the world better, sometimes you can say it's naive. And in fact, you're not going to make the world. The world has serious problems and you're not going to do anything at all. The world is getting worse and worse now. We're heading into polarization on one hand. And on the other hand, does the current technological wave carry an optimism within it beyond saying, yeah, we're going to automate? In fact, we're going to replace.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily the entrepreneur's role to solve all the world's big problems. And besides, we've oversold the idea that we're going to change the world by creating startups.
That's true.
The reality is that most companies do workflows and internal business processes that are a bit boring. But you see, we were doing something that was maybe sexier than average with restaurant reservations. At least people knew about it. It can speak to everyone. Nevertheless, we weren't saving lives.
You help restaurants.
Yes, we were helping restaurant owners. But what I mean by that is that if you optimize the daily life by half an hour a day for someone in a company's HR department, well, actually, you can get a lot of satisfaction from it because you're making that person's life easier. And you can feel like you're having a positive impact without necessarily solving one of the major societal problems.
Because you're boosting productivity from 15.5 to 15.7%.
Yes, but multiply by the number of people you reach. Maybe that's what you're saying too. That you can have, well, even if in the end you have an impact on a lot of people, even if that individual impact doesn't seem extremely.
And beyond measuring that impact, those famous 15 minutes saved per day, I don't know, we were getting messages every single day from customers telling us, "This is great. It's changed my life. I have more time to spend with my kids. I can leave earlier. I'm less."
Restaurant owners. But that's what's so great, I think, ZenChef, by giving restaurant owners that direct access to the internet and direct access to their customers. And without paying a commission per booking, you're letting restaurant owners focus on their craft, stay independent, keep their local cuisine and their unique expertise rather than joining a big chain or seeing their margins completely eaten up by a global player like the one with that business model or the one you replaced.
But so now that I'm in the process of thinking about a new company, my reflex after leaving ZenChef was to ask myself, okay, what are the world's big problems? I think there's a part of me that says, okay, I managed to build a business with my first company.
But ZenChef might not have been a major world problem, but still, the independence of restaurant owners, instead of just having big chains with industrialized processes, well, for that, the owner needs to be able to reach and retain their customers, manage those relationships.
Of course. No, but anyway, I'm really proud of.
Big problem, small problem. Either way, it's positive for the world. And you, ZenChef, succeeded by capturing a portion of that value. And will tomorrow, if you say, I'm making a workflow that improves document processing? Anyway, I don't know. If fundamentally AI brings it's faster, but where are we going faster? Because if you say, I'm going faster, that's fine. But you have to be going somewhere.
I think the human driver is to use technology in one way or another to improve daily tasks. And we can go all the way back to prehistory. It's something that's hard coded into progress. Exactly. So we move toward it without necessarily knowing why we're going there or the direction. But if we can do it, if it's available, the technology exists, we're gonna exploit it. There's a need for it.
So it's not a driver for you. You could be making missiles or ZenChef. It's all the same.
Well, something that destroys society, maybe that wouldn't be where I'd find fulfillment in my daily life.
But there's a need for that too, Hede. The world has changed again.
Yeah, well, I don't know anything about it, and I'm sure there are plenty of defense companies that are super interesting. And often it must be people who come from that industry and who have seen some problems to solve.
And to protect us. So in any case, it solves the problem for sure. After that, okay. Okay, I think it's a difficult question, at least today, to say technology. What is its impact on society? And I think that for 20 years, we had technology promise things, some were delivered, and in other places, the effect is rather negative. So when you say it's destructive, well, I don't know if the impact of social media, of Instagram on society, I don't know. There are probably positive impacts that we don't see because we quickly got used to the positive side. And so we say, nah, that's normal. And we see the negative side more. But there are still sides, aspects.
Yeah. So, if you could choose the world we live in, would you prefer a world where there's less technology or no social media? Do you think it would be better for the human race?
Me, today, I spent a certain amount of time on Instagram, and I don't think it brings me much. I used to smoke cigarettes before. I had a nicotine addiction. Honestly, I don't know if I don't put Instagram on the same level. It takes up my time, it doesn't bring me much. I have a hard time letting go with it. Maybe Instagram brings me little things, but in any case, I don't think it was at the beginning. The addiction was created because at first it was a way to get news from my friends, people I was close to, and to get more news. But today, that's no longer the case. It's something else and it's something else. And I don't know if it brings me. I don't know if the net for me as an individual and then for society, that's another question. So, would I have less technology? There are technologies that are very good.
So it's more about selected technologies, or at least stopping technologies from becoming perverted, you know? That's what you're saying?
Yeah. But again, we're recording right now. We're going to make shorts. We're going to put them on Instagram to reach people. So that's going to, I hope it'll be useful. Then you go on YouTube, you have longer formats. And I think there's more substance and they're less about addiction, a bit of the adrenaline of immediacy, of the dopamine that it brings you there, having a 15-second short. So I don't know. I think there's a real question about,
Besides, you have more and more governments that are legislating to quite simply ban social media before the age of 14 or 15.
yeah,
Furthermore, so we're starting to realize all of that.
there you go. So I think that, well, I don't know, but I imagine that when you look at your projects, and then also I think that from a point of view, independently of the somewhat naive or optimistic side of saying, I'm going to do good in the world, but when you do, you want to produce a technology. So via a company. I think the fact that this technology has an impact, that it creates value for the world, well, that's what makes it so that you're going to get value back. And if this value is solely in automation, I think that on the one hand, it's very easy to commoditize, meaning that you can bring it, but anyone else can bring it because you're recoding a workflow. And it's rather low. And besides, they say in economics that productivity gains, we can never really, economists, they talk about productivity gains. Cars are much better today than they were 40 years ago, but in terms of purchasing power, they still represent the same percentage. So we haven't actually seen where the car's improvement, we haven't seen that materialize for society as something significantly better. So I think if you're just focused on, well, just on productivity, I don't know if maybe you can't create a company that big, or maybe you can't even get a business to work, in my opinion, if it doesn't go beyond that. And AI today, I don't know if it goes beyond that. I feel like the whole AI project is just that. Well, it's a question.
Yeah, there's a question I've been asking myself. For the 24-year-old Xavier, who would have been influenced by what we see everywhere on social media today, where they sell us shortcuts to basically just get rich. That's the goal. And entrepreneurship is just a means to get there. And they try to completely oversimplify this narrative, showing that it's actually very easy to start a company and get rich. And some people have made a business out of it. And for them, it actually works. But it's because
Excel,
they jam,
sell a dream.
sell that dream. And I think that's dangerous.
But that's Instagram for you, right? It's a lot of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm bringing it up.
People selling you the method to sell the method. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But then again, I think since we're talking about ways of making decisions and choosing, actually, I'm thinking about it as we talk. But I think for me, at least, when I have options, I tell myself that there's a lot of value, a bit of hidden value in an option that creates value for me, but also around me for the ecosystem. Because I figure that if value is created around me, I'll end up capturing even more of it. As opposed to options where you think it might look better if you do a simple first order calculation, it might look better because you think you'll get a bigger slice of the pie, but you're more in a zero sum game. You have less of an ecosystem vision, and in the medium term, I think that when you're just taking a bigger slice of the pie for yourself and less for others, since you're not growing the pie, in the medium term, it'll be worse for you. And I factor that into my choices, I think. And I say it's better to choose something where you develop everything around it, even if it looks worse. It'll create a network effect around you, even if it feels like the value's on the outside right now. One day it'll come back.
Yeah. So for 360 learning, is that something you told yourself?
I think so, yes. With collaborative learning, the fact that, well, there were many other dimensions. The aspect of giving the user a tool to create their training courses more easily. But it's kind of the same thinking, saying that if all users can easily create training courses, they'll create lots of them and will create lots of value. So, okay, I sold him the tool, but he's the one creating its value. It's his. But basically, we're making the pie bigger.
But you see, to bounce off your point, If you create a workflow that helps someone all alone in their corner, there's a good chance your company will disappear because you don't actually have that network effect. Whereas if you orchestrate processes and actually create a real platform and develop an ecosystem, you'll create a defensibility for your company
That's it.
that's much stronger. And those are the types of companies that will win in the medium term.
In AI, in the age of AI, it feels like this defensibility is becoming harder and harder to build because defensibility used to be about having data, having software that's hard to replicate. Well, all of that is commoditized now. Having a go to market, but you can actually automate the go to market. So, what's left? What kind of barrier to entry is there? And today, even VCs, I see VCs who are supposed to be good, who talk a lot, and they say, no, but today the moat is actually speed. So, these are people who don't understand what a moat is. But maybe it's because there are no moats left, actually.
Well, one interesting angle I see in quite a few AI companies is going after tasks that before their tool weren't being done by another tool, meaning not replacing existing software, but replacing a task done by a human. An example is voice assistants. So we'll capture calls coming into a company and we'll improve call handling using AI. And so we'll start rebuilding the company's system of record, but at a stage that was previously handled by a human. And little by little, we'll redevelop the whole feature set. So it's an entry point that allows for innovation and gradually replaces the existing market leader. And it's a pattern I see happening in quite a few industries right now.
Okay, this idea behind saying we have the sauce stage where we built a database in the cloud, basically that's SaaS, a database accessible via the cloud with workflows that are somewhat
Exactly.
automated. And once we've done that everywhere, now with AI, we'll be able to replace the human who operated those workflows. So I definitely agree that's kind of what we're seeing. Now, that's where I have a question. Does this improve the world? Because you're saying the project is to replace the human. So fine, we replace the human doing tasks with a machine. And then what do? What's the societal project behind it? What does the human do? If we say, well, humans will just stay home, eat tomatoes, be warm and fed, do nothing, read books, or we'll just put them in front of Instagram. Actually, what's the project? Because when Facebook said connecting people, later they divided, they connected, the debate is open. In any case, the promise was clear. I found it powerful. And it's true that with AI, I wonder, where is the promise?
I think that someone listening to our podcast in 20 years would really mock us, saying they didn't see that. They were really stupid. It seemed obvious there'd be this new industry where we'd all take vacations in space. And then again, I'm talking nonsense because often what we see in movies isn't what happens at all, it's something else.
I don't think there's a chance they'll say they didn't see that every 70 years there was a world war.
It's possible too.
And they didn't see that this technology was the thing that would accelerate an old conflict.
It's possible, but then there will surely be an aftermath. Even if, okay, there's a world war, in fact, there is an aftermath.
Exactly. I think a good way to avoid conflicts is when there's a project that unifies. And I'm saying that here, a technology is appearing that's very powerful, but doesn't carry within it, or at least no one can formulate, a societal project.
There's a project that's emerging about sharing knowledge. Democratization of knowledge, I think.
Yeah. Is that specific to AI? That was already Google's project, the largest database to connect people. Now, connecting people,
Yes.
Is it finally? I know from having had investors in the capital who were quite obsessed, very pushy about AI, and I think that's the case for all investors on all company boards, regardless of their size. Today, they say you have to have a strategy. Uh,
build AI company.
and for that matter, I know what their motivation is. Their motivation is to improve the company's EBITDA. It's to increase profitability because we hope for huge productivity gains, and so we'll be able to reduce the payroll. So today, I feel like the project is it a project that will improve society? I don't know. Maybe it will open up new possibilities. Maybe it will be great. But in the very short term, I feel it's something quite pragmatic, rational. We're going to improve business productivity.
Yes, but it's still peculiar to say we're going to create a technology. When we created trains, it created a net gain in jobs. Here, we're in a rather special case where we say a large part of what's said about AI, theorized by investors in the ecosystem, is what we were saying earlier, meaning SaaS. We created databases with workflows in the cloud. And with AI now, we're replacing the operator of that database because now that we've put software at the core on the system of record, it's good because we can expand right next to it and replace the human. And that, I think, is something new, and which, in any case, deserves to be noted, I find, and which, for me, raises a question, though I'm not necessarily critical.
No, but I'm thinking of an example. You see, there were a lot of salespeople at ZenChef. It's a company that's maybe 40% of the company are salespeople. And I know that in every company, and ours too, a salesperson's worst nightmare is filling out the CRM
That's true.
because a salesperson's job is to build customer relationships.
Because usually the CRM page takes a minute to load.
Well, but even with a CRM, imagine the best CRM, the most modern, the simplest. You still have to open a page, summarize what was said with the client, the prospect.
Very administrative.
And so that represents a significant portion of their time.
So we automate it.
You automate it, and what happens? Well, the salesperson spends more time with their clients, their prospects, they'll be more fulfilled in their job.
And the goal of AI companies today is to replace the salesperson.
Oh, yes, eventually, but that's the goal of technology.
Exactly. I think that's quite new.
Yeah, but I don't believe in that at all. I think you'll have somewhat augmented salespeople, but there are still certain decisions being made because you're buying the trust you gain from another human being who's selling you something. And I don't think that's going to change. Besides, well, I'm also thinking about it. I have two children who are 2 and 4 years old. I tell myself that surely 90% of the jobs that exist today will have disappeared by the time they enter the workforce. So, how do we think right now about what they should be trained for? What's the right toolkit for them?
I want to clarify a bit because we're on the choice and we're trying to understand how we make decisions, how we make choices. I'm focusing on this topic of the societal project, and I think it's because for me personally, it's part of my methods, starting from first principles. And so I have a vision of the world reduced to simple things, because to think it only works by saying simple things. And I have a few simple ideas that try to guide all my choices and thus create a system because I have these kinds of criteria. And I think that in this system, well, at some point, especially in technology, I try to have a vision of the world of where we're going. And I tell myself, okay, that way, when I make my decisions day after day, I'm guided by this final vision of the project. And so it allows me to sort through decisions and also to ensure that all the choices I make are consistent. And it's true that with AI, there's a moment where I ask myself, but what's the vision here? Nobody works anymore. We've replaced them all. There's a system running. And we're building with Jupy, we talk about it, but actually, people need to be able to make their decisions with as little intervention as possible. The AI scores, finds the best option, says, okay, we've decided the option is this, now here's the next decision. And all of that happens somewhat automatically. And at some point, you say to yourself, well, okay, that's what we're doing, and I have this thing.
You can't picture it. You're saying, to make good decisions again, I have to picture what will happen if I ever do. XYZ. And right now, I'm having a hard time picturing it because it just seems absurd.
What does the world look like at the end of all this? Is it better?
I think you're overestimating the adaptation capabilities.
Adaptation.
No, of AI. You know, everyone talks about when we'll reach artificial general intelligence, AGI, which will be able to make decisions because that's kind of the last thing humans will have left.
Certain decisions.
It's certain complex decisions. That will have to be made by a human, but maybe one day there'll be that famous singularity moment where, well, even AI will be able to make those decisions. And I feel like that moment won't happen anytime soon. Or maybe it'll never happen at all.
Well, we're running tests every single day. And you see, we have something we're testing right now that listens to our internal conversations. And with the transcript, after we've talked with our team at Jupy, we get a message saying, here are the decisions that need to be made now following this conversation. And it's extremely precise. And on top of that, it gives you options in a very detailed way. And I think we're not far from the moment where we're just sitting here talking and you have a system that says, okay, now we do this, we decide that, the next steps are these. And then it'll just tell you, hey, you talked about this, but you didn't do it. It's time you take this action. And I think it's moving fast regardless. And what you were saying is on a 1 year scale, it's slow. I think on a 5 or 10 year scale, that's going to be spectacular. And I believe we're not being very intentional about the societal project. So, to clarify, I think that's it. Is that I find that no one, in fact, today is able to really think through the technology. And I think it's the first time. There's always been a transformation in society, people who thought about it and were able to say, this is where we're going, this is the world we're building. And now I think no one has any idea of the world we're currently building.
Yeah.
There are companies that are trying a bit, Anthropic and so on, that have this kind of parallel thing of saying, we build the models, but we think about why they're gonna be applied, and how at least we can safeguard the thing, you know? But it's true that it's more how we manage to make the thing secure rather than saying, okay, where are we going and what's the project, you know?
And today, these past few weeks, it's true. Some people say, no, we won't destroy jobs because while some are lost, others are created. And yet we see that the big tech companies are out there. I fired 15,000 people. I'm gonna let another 20,000 people go because I've automated thanks to AI. We look at it and say, but is it that they're laying people off because they want more profit and that? They have, or maybe in some consulting firms, they have business model issues and they're using AI as an excuse to justify to the market, in fact, economic job cuts? Or are they really using AI to destroy jobs that are replaced, recreated slower than the speed at which technology destroys them? And I think that for maybe 3 months now, before everyone thought, no, but actually, when there's a revolution, we recreate jobs. Now I think the question's being asked a bit more.
Yeah, I agree. Technological cycles and disruptions are much faster. The cycles are shorter, which means that, and political election cycles are also very fast. And all of this creates a context where no one really takes the time or finds the interest to look long term.
And to decide.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, well, I'm thinking of policies, I don't know, in France when we decided to develop a sector around nuclear power, we imagined society was going in one direction, but it took a long time. We had time to adapt to that. Today, you have to plan for something that's going to revolutionize the world in 5 years.
Yeah, and it's too difficult. So we're kind of on autopilot. We let technology go. We try to regulate a bit in Europe. We're not quite succeeding. And we're not sure.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've read that book, Anti-Fragile, by Taleb
Anti-fragile.
on resilience. And precisely, I think that today it's impossible to anticipate changes. The only thing that human beings and society in general can do is be ready to react to all eventualities and know that we're still going to survive, whatever the scenario.
Do you ever think about whether AI is going to take my job? You know, for us as creators, business leaders to say, but actually, I see the moment coming where my own value is reduced by artificial intelligence.
I'm convinced that entrepreneurs, on the contrary, are the ones who will build tomorrow's world.
Why? What part of the job will survive? And
But no, but what's an entrepreneur's daily obsession? As soon as you have a company that starts growing, it's precisely to fire yourself from most of the tasks that you do daily and either automate them or delegate them so that only the core essence of the entrepreneur's job remains, which is giving direction, gonna talk about your company to the market, to investors, and making sure there's enough cash on the company. But so to manage to do very, very few things very, very well, you precisely have to use automation and technology to the max. And I think those few key topics I mentioned won't be replaced by artificial intelligence.
representing, embodying things. So, undoubtedly, in that embodiment, you have a kind of brand of yourself. You represent a level of trust that can be placed in the person you are and your history, your track record. So, that's quite human. I agree. Then the relationships you can have with investors or with people you know, I think that remains the intuitive persona aspect. But it's true that AI still allows you to find the right person, the right information much faster. I think that value is still, but not just with AI, for 50 years. There was a time when you had a Rolodex. You knew people. It was a truly phenomenal value because just knowing who to call was worth a lot. I think that's decreasing though. And then, well, giving direction, yeah, I agree. So there are funds being created. We're hearing about private equity funds in France right now. I know Wendell in particular, who's creating a fund to like bridge that VC stage to a stage that's a bit more private equity. And so it's growth, as they say, meaning the shift between companies. So it's a stage now that's becoming. There are specialists who say, well, actually, this company is going to move from this stage to the next. So there are people starting up at that point. I don't know if there are funds because it's true, to do a build up like what you're doing at ZenChef, you have to finance the consolidations. So you have to buy the first company and then you have to buy the platform, then you have to buy all the add-ons, the acquisitions, and each time it's tens of millions.
Yep.
And that's for one line. But since you're a fund, you want to do 10 dozens of lines. So it's at least billion-dollar funds. And that's a scale we don't have in France and even hardly in Europe. So you say, I'm confident it'll be resolved.
A political decision is needed here, for sure.
That's what's needed.
But if we wanted to direct savings toward.
Oh, yes, I think we're doomed. If we don't want to keep selling all our great companies to the Americans.
A political decision is needed for either savings or pensions to go into pension funds or private equity funds to. And besides, I think there were, well, I don't have the exact figure, but I think people calculated that if this reform had been made for pension capitalization in the 90s when it was presented, now, 30 years later, after a whole cycle, retirees would have 1.6 times the pension they currently have because, well, the economy has grown a lot. And so, if instead of having this pay as you go system, we put the money into funds that invested in companies that eventually sold them and then paid the pension to the retirees, well, they would have, then we.
It's incomprehensible that we still don't have a pension system based on.
Capitalization. Now, there's a confusion because people often think that capitalization is opposed to solidarity. It's true that today we pool everything together. One generation pays for the next, but it's not because we're moving into the economy. There's an investment cycle, then divestment, we sell the companies, and then we pay the pensions. That doesn't mean the system can't also be mutualized. And so, in the collective mind, especially in France, there's this idea that capitalization is the market. The market is individualistic. And so, this system would be opposed to a solidarity based system. But in fact, they're two different things, independent. It's what we mutualize on one hand, and we can continue to mutualize. And then it's whether this pension money. Then there's a technical difficulty, which is the transition, because today the money goes from workers to retirees. And if we want it to go into the economy,
There's a gap to fill, you know?
you have to make a switch between the two, and it takes 30 years to make the switch, and it's a bit complicated.
Now, I think there are 2 points on this subject. First, funded pension systems already exist
Yes, a little bit. That's true.
in the public sector.
True, public sector.
That's let's.
It's surprising.
Right. I think that few people.
No, it's surprising.
And two, I think it's a two-way street because the people who benefit from this system consequently take more interest in the economy since their pension depends on corporate growth. And so they're going to look a bit more at what's happening on the stock market. They'll naturally want to develop their education on finance and the economy. And it'll also create a form of solidarity from everyone toward companies because we want everyone to perform, because we benefit directly, rather than sometimes a somewhat oppositional discourse. Big companies on one side being the bad guys, and then the employees.
It realigns the incentive, Sal.
And there's no doubt that in American culture, The fact that all Americans have their pension money invested in private equity funds that own American companies, it creates a kind of economic nationalism where Americans say to themselves, but I'm for American companies. I prefer to buy American because, in fact, by doing so, I contribute to my own retirement. It's something I'm doing for myself. Whereas we in Europe don't have that. And so we tend to be more agnostic and say, well, I'll buy the cheapest, whether it's French or foreign. We don't have that thing like the Americans who want to make America great again, or now they say America first. We don't have this. And it's true, no doubt, that capitalization. So I like what we're doing here because we talked about AI, commoditizing everything, etc. And then we zoomed in on Zen Chef with private equity. So we understand this model thanks to what you explained to us. It changes the company's decisions a bit, etc. But it's a different model, yet it works. And then we understand that typically for Zen Chef, but for all these other companies making this shift, meaning all those that reach a certain size, in fact, we're doomed to have foreign players, mostly Americans, coming in to capture the upside once we reach a significant scale. We say it's not great, but to change that, we'd need to be, well, very intentional and say, but this isn't what we want. That's not the project. We like to change the way it works, but that requires a decision. And it's a very deep decision. It's a political decision about something that is the social model anyway. And that's a very complicated subject, but that's what limits us. That's why it's hard to say, well, we'd need 100 Zen chefs like that. Yes, but we'd prefer it to be 100, and that we manage to scale up so that it benefits European retirees, and not just American pension funds and retirees.
What was maybe another option then for Zen Chef if you hadn't been bought out by a PE fund? What was the alternative?
We were profitable and had very strong growth, so we had plenty of options. And it happened without us even trying. We hadn't started a process. We didn't have an investment banker. We hadn't decided to sell the company. We just got a very good offer that we accepted. So if that event hadn't happened, we would have most certainly continued for a few more years. While, of course, staying in touch with the market and seeing what opportunities would have surely come up later. So, but we were very happy running the company with my two partners and continuing.
So, moving on, another type of decision that you make personally, you mentioned it a bit earlier, is investment decisions. You're an excellent business angel, well known in the field for the relevance of your investments. How do you choose to invest when you're presented with a deal? How do you decide to put money into a startup?
Well, at first, I tried to analyze things by looking at the deck, the numbers, the market, building a conviction, and so on. And honestly, I messed up quite a bit. And so, in the end, honestly, all the boxes were checked, all the planets were aligned. And then, after 1 year, 2 years, the entrepreneurs call me out of the blue and say, no, actually, we're going to stop. We're less interested in the subject. There's less potential, and so on. And so, the common denominator that I learned from those bad experiences is simply the entrepreneur's ability to be resilient in a market that offers significant potential with great depth. And so now I just try to spend time with the entrepreneurs and understand what their deep motivations are that will keep them there. In 2, 3, 4, 5 years, despite all the difficulties they'll inevitably face, the pivots, the crises, and so on. So now, for early stage, mind you, I'm getting into companies that are very young.
In terms of revenue?
Exactly. That are still finding their way. And so at this stage, I think you can invest almost exclusively in the team and in a market you believe in.
So, what you're saying is the team and the team's resilience.
Yes, meaning that within the team, resilience is also about whether they get along well. Have the roles been clearly defined? What's the risk of conflict that could lead to them wanting to split up? Right. It's the team's ability to stay together and be resilient. Now, I'm not a good business angel at all, as you might have said.
What is your
I think it was more to make fun of you.
do you have figures you can share? Did it work? What kind of multiple will you make?
No, but there are. I've made about 15 investments, and I think only three have failed so far.
That's not bad.
And the others, some of them,
What kind of multiple do you think you'll make in the end?
honestly, if I can just get all of my money back, I'll be happy.
I think I'm at about the same level as you. I'm thinking between 1 and 1.5x, but honestly, if I make 1x,
0x.
uh,
That's fine.
we'll still be happy.
No, but what that means is that
It's difficult.
it's a profession. And even when it's your profession, you can be wrong. When I say it's a profession, I mean the VCs, except that for them, first of all, it's not their personal money. And they do enough of them to have a chance. That one in the bunch will be stratospheric. Whereas when you do it as a business angel, unless you want it to become your job and do only that, some do it and surely better than others. But if you do it at an opportunity because someone mentions a company now and then, well, it's unlikely to succeed.
That's for sure. But I still think it's interesting to say, before investing, I look. And I agree, the criterion. I think it really works well. And that's it. It's the resilience and determination of the team. I'd say there are two parts. There's the resilience in the face of crises, and there's the determination to come back every morning. Try something new, because if you try 1,000 times, you're more likely to succeed than someone who tries 200 times. So it's a bit of a game. Of large numbers, the more things you try, the more chance you have that one will succeed, especially if you try many things, but all toward the same goal. So it's the somewhat schizophrenic thing of saying, I'm doing lots of things, but in fact, these things are
Several.
very focused. Yeah.
To be a good business angel, you have to study psychology. To understand what break there might have been in the entrepreneur's life before they were an entrepreneur that makes them never give up.
It won't turn back, you know?
Won't give up. In fact, there's only one possible path, and that's to win in the end.
Yeah, Sequoia does that a lot in interviews. I think they're known for the fact that they really investigate the entrepreneur's psychology and that resilience, that determination. And like you said, for it to work, it has to be at a point where there's almost a trauma, a breaking point that conditioned this temperament of wanting to come back in an unreasonable way, to try, not to say. No, no, I want this to succeed, and I'll come back as many times as it takes for it to work. So that's a great criterion. And then I think it's interesting regarding these kinds of decisions, which are investment decisions. It's quite specific, but I think it applies to other types of decisions. I talked about it with Jean David Chamberdon, the head of ESI, the founder of ESI, who mentored me at 300 Learning and became a friend. We spoke 3 times a week for 10 years. And when I was doing those business angel tickets, since he has a track record, I think they're on their 4th fund now, and they have spectacular performance, over 20, between 20 and 30% a year. That's really impressive. And then he tells me, well, we see 2,000 files a year, and in the end, we write 3 checks. And I thought to myself, well, I say yes half the time, and I probably have a worse deal flow. And so he told me that, and I stopped after that. It was him. When he told me that, I just couldn't. I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm done investing.
Well, if you want to do it also because you want to give back to the ecosystem,
Yes, no, yeah. Then there are ways it's to have, well, typically for me, someone like John David who says, hey, there's a company, there's a founder you might get along well with, invest with us and take a role where you're going to help him a little bit. So I did that. Now I have less time, but I did that and it works. But I think it's interesting the idea of saying there's a decision to be made. And actually, I don't know if I have the best compass because it's very difficult. But I see 2,000 of them. And so my compass is more or less accurate. But even if it's only roughly accurate, since I'm selecting 3 out of 2,000, I'm still picking something that's better than average. So it's really the brute force approach, to the problem.
In the sense that you think your compass gets sharper because you've seen 2000, or you.
I really imagine a compass. For those watching us, it's a bit geometric, but let's say if this is the good companies. Imagine I have a compass that's a bit poorly adjusted. It's over here.
It's going to calibrate, right? You calibrate it.
And since I'm going to take just the top 1,000th, well, they're not the absolute best companies. I'm a little bit below. But I'm still very high on the axis, because I was a bit off, but since I was extremely selective. Well, as visual, I represent it to myself visually, but it's to say, even if I have a bias and I can't really differentiate the, I don't know, imagine apples. You say, well, okay, I can tell an apple from one that's a bit less ripe or not as good. Well, it's not perfect because I don't see very well, but since I've looked at 2,000, in the end, the three I picked, they still have a good chance of being among the best. And I think it's a decision making method that's interesting. I don't know if it can be applied to many things in life, but I still think, for example, in recruitment, I know that Sophie, my wife, when we started in the US, she was looking for a CMO to start the US operations. It was a very important decision to make who to hire because the cycle is maybe a year when you try someone out. If it's not the right person, we often make mistakes. And really, to succeed in the US for 360 Learning's international expansion, we needed an American in marketing. So it was the first American hire. She did 197, 193 interviews. It took 9 months. She was doing almost only that. Every day she had 2 interviews. And because we thought we're not attractive in the US, we could be wrong, and that's it. And so she was in charge of this project. And so she succeeded. And it was brute force. And it's interesting, I think. We often have them to say you need humility and to say, I'm going to brute force the problem.
And that also requires having a decision that for which there's time, not to rush the decision or to not have this deadline factor that's too.
Not having FOMO, too present, you could say, for 360 Learning, we have to open the US tomorrow. And it's true that saying, actually, she was saying, well, no, but I'll do it when I'm sure it's the right person.
Sometimes there's maybe on certain decisions an advantage of no deadline. There isn't one.
That's true.
So your point is, depending on the size of the company and the maturity, do you have a speed that's more or less important? Or else, with the experience you have now,
Wow.
On speed, anyway, if I can add something, then I'll let you answer. But on speed, it's a consensus. For sure, you're right. Everyone says you have to make decisions fast. And I like to take the example of Elon Musk and rockets, because on a rocket design cycle for SpaceX, you could say, but a rocket, there's so much investment, better to be sure of what you're doing and better not to blow up the rocket. And yet, even on that, he says, I won because I launched many more rockets, so I gathered more data, so we improved. And actually, by making decisions faster, even imperfect decisions, well, by making those decisions faster, he managed to win. And so that goes, it seems, to go against what we were saying before about saying I'm going to brute force spy. But actually, I don't know. I think it's a false opposition. Because in reality, you can also say, for example, I did 200 interviews. Actually, I made 200 decisions not to hire someone. So I did it in a somewhat conservative way. But it's not. I think what wouldn't have worked is saying, I'm going to do one interview per month. And then you're slow. So I think speed is whatever the size of the company, you need speed in decisions. You have to decide fast rather than perfectly. And I think it's not necessarily contradictory with the thing that sometimes it's brute force and you're struggling, it's hard. So I'm going to give myself 200 options. That's how I'm going to win because I'll examine 200 options or 2,000 in John David's case.
2000,
Options.
I agree. I think the value of a company is the sum of the cumulative experiences of the company and therefore of the people. And so, experience, by definition, is doing things and failing in most cases and learning a lesson from it that will be useful. And so, the more things you do, the more decisions you make on a daily basis, the more likely you are to have accumulated more experience than your competitor on a subject.
Of course.
And so, in that sense, indeed, making very fast decisions has a huge benefit because that's what allows the company to learn much more quickly. Now, I think that's valid for maybe 99% of decisions. And then there's 1% at Jeff Bezos says there are decisions that involve the life or death of the company. These are often made by the CEO of the company. And these ones, they must be carefully considered. But it's very few, it's a tiny fraction of the decisions.
Or decisions that are not reversible.
They're not reversible. Yeah.
Yeah, one-way door. Exactly. And so, on investment, another bias, often in investment decisions, is the herd effect. And so that's the thing that makes this game both a bit fun and also, when you're an entrepreneur on the other side, terrible. It's the herd mentality and the FOMO of VCs, where all of a sudden, because there's one who wants to do the deal and has a good brand, or when everyone is looking, someone says, well, I'm going to do a term sheet. And everyone knows it. And then suddenly the others are afraid of missing out on the deal. And in the end, everyone makes a deal. Then you say, but what is this company? And they can't even explain it to you. Then it makes a difference. A spectacular contrast between two companies. Just because there was this herd effect. In your investments, have you ever, has it been a criterion for you to say, oh, so and so is investing? Nicholas Hernandez is investing, so I'm going to put in a ticket.
But of course,
But how you prevent it?
even though I know it, yeah, even though I know it, you have those trendy restaurants opening up. When you call it the beginning to book, everything is full all the time for a month because they want everyone to say, did you try to book? It's full. And then, in fact, there's never any room.
Classic.
And in fact, afterwards, you win the next 11 months by being truly full, even if when you go during the first month, it's empty. But yes, it's hard to resist that bias, I think, in decisions. I think that's where it's important for business decisions to have a system. It's to say to yourself, okay, my system, well, it's to go and look at the market.
System?
Well, exactly. It's to define criteria, steps that we're going to force ourselves to go through to reach a decision. And in particular, I think there's one that's very important for debiasing, which is to make the decision only when we've had an opinion contrary to the decision we want to make. So if it's for an investment, you could say, I won't decide to invest until I have someone whose opinion is qualified, who has expertise on the subject, and who's explained to me why. It's not a good decision to invest in this company. And then if I still do it. But it's true that sometimes we take shortcuts, we want to go fast, we're offered an opportunity, we know everyone's looking at it, and so on. And we want to go for it. And that doesn't mean at all that it's a good decision.
Because actually, it means there would still be unknown unknowns that you wouldn't know about what you're choosing. So if someone hasn't told you, oh, well, it's not good because of this and that, it means that actually there might be things that aren't good that you just don't know about.
That's why it's important to make it a profession when you want to invest and to take the time needed to make the right decisions.
Or stop? Are you still doing that?
No, exactly, because I don't want to make it my profession. If I wanted to make it a profession, I'd be obsessed with creating the best system possible to make as few mistakes as possible.
What's impressive is that even among professionals, among VCs, the herd mentality is spectacular. I hear about VCs in London who are supposed to be super, who claim, at least, to be very premium and selective. And actually, the only time they go, you see them on startups, files where you want to invest. And all of a sudden, because I don't know, earlier I was talking about Sequoia, which is often mentioned in the VC world. There's a technological disruption, and in the end, Sequoia wins because they're often the ones with the winning companies. And so you have VCs where, well, as soon as they look at a file for a month, and then one day Sequoia does a term sheet in 48 hours, and you have the other one who, in half a day, says, oh, well, we're super strong too, because look here. We managed to mobilize in 24 hours to do a term sheet. And actually, it's just they did it because they saw Sequoia do it. And they'd had a month to do it. They hadn't hurried.
No, but once again, in early stage, I think it's very uncertain. It's hard to predict what's going to happen in the companies. And besides, I think a study came out not long ago comparing two early stage VC strategies between the one who does spray and pray, so maybe 50 deals on a fund, and the one who does 15 but puts in larger amounts. And actually, in the end, the one who does 50 has a better performance.
Yeah, spray and pray, which is kind of trendy.
Yeah.
Works really well.
And I think that's proven if you look at the performances.
You take it directionally. If I do all the AI startups or whatever, you take very simple criteria and you do all the deals. Kind of like I let someone else do the valuation and I try to be in the deals.
Oh, really?
Be more. It's sad. In any case, I know that if I were a beast, a professional one too, really, my mentality would be to say, I'm going to do things others don't do. And it would drive me completely crazy to think I'm reduced to following in others' footsteps because I'm a sheep. It would keep me up at night. I couldn't stand it. I'd have to find a way to tell myself,
Well, build your own system.
yeah, exactly.
To have the otherwise, if you follow others, you're actually borrowing their system.
Yes, yes, yeah. That's it. Having your own system and differentiating yourself in your decisions rather than, in fact, relying on what the market does to do the same thing.
Maybe using Juppy and VC funds will help solve this problem.
Yeah, completely change VC. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. As a CEO, did you have routines for your decisions? How did you go about deciding key things? Whether it was a budget, a hire, a project to launch internally, a product change? Did you have a routine or did you just go with your gut?
Again, I think most decisions I try to delegate them. So, in the end, the ones left for me were, I hope, the most important decisions. And I have more of a collaborative style. So, I have an intuition. So, I'll pretty quickly arrive at an intuition of what the right decision would be. And then I'll try to go find the best people in my team, in the organization, to give their opinion on the subject. And in the end, ideally, let them make the decision, which is a consensus. To do that in a very short amount of time.
And when you delegate a decision, what does that mean? To you, is delegating a decision choosing a person and telling them, okay, you need to make this decision? Do you tell them anything else? Do you check what they decided afterwards? I mean, how does it work?
Well, yes, for me, it's telling someone, look, you're in charge of deciding, I don't know, to open this new market. And look, you have 1 month to go get all the information needed to make this decision. And here's how the decision should be made in the end.
And so that's how it is. Like, I don't know, there's a certain budget. In any case, you give them some, I imagine, constraints.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, for me, most decisions should be made quickly and with a collaboration that ideally leads to a consensus. And sometimes there isn't one. And that's where it's interesting to have a single person responsible for making the call when there's no consensus.
You're more team founder mode. There's the superior leader, a bit vertical. Jupiter, who's going to have a stroke of genius that no one else could have had, and who centralizes all the information. And that allows him to be like super lucid compared to the others. Or rather, team, the group will reach a consensus and decide. Knowing that the criticism of that is that sometimes people say consensus or the group will end up with weak decisions and won't manage, especially in business, to make Elon Musk style bets or super contrarian things that will differentiate and innovate and move things forward.
It comes back to the type of decision, meaning there are everyday decisions, that allow the company to function. And those, in my opinion, the best way is to make them collaboratively. It can even be counterproductive to have a single person who isn't very well informed doing it. And conversely, whether it's in the early days of a company where there are always big bets to be made, because the goal is to reach product market fit. And so you have to test a lot of things. And there, I think the best mode is that of one person or a very small group who will make lots of decisions very quickly, very important, very risky to gain experience. And that's relevant. Or when you're in an established company, but there are still major challenges where you need to seek out risks. You have to take risks. And then at that point, you might need to go back into founder mode, but on something that's separate from the main business. That runs day to day.
And would you say it's because there's the ability to take risks and to take them on somewhat alone? Taking a risk by saying, well, actually, we're going to do this and I'll take responsibility when the group doesn't have that capacity to say, well, we're going to take a very risky path because we wouldn't accept the consequences. Is that it?
Exactly. And besides, sometimes you get that frustration. When you go from a company with 10, then 30, then 50 people, and then you pass 100, you feel like there's this inertia, specifically that everything slows down, that people are less willing to take risks. And that's where I think, and I don't necessarily know if I've succeeded at this, but building a system where people are incentivized to keep taking risks daily and to move fast in their decisions.
Do you have 2 hours? We have 30 minutes left. Yeah, we're good. We have the final part. In yours, during those years, you sometimes spoke out on Medium back then. And I remember you talked, and we talked about it a bit together too. You talked not necessarily about burnout, but about times when, well, a lot is happening. And on top of that, there was a time, a bit of a productivity trend. So we were all trying to be giga productive and everything, answering tons of emails in a row. As I know you also talked about meditation regarding that. You told me you'd done some meditation exercises and all. Can you tell us a bit more about how, well, those meditation exercises can help organize thoughts to see more clearly when you're doing many things in parallel, especially?
Yeah, well, I think that I don't have a meditation practice as regular as I'd like. On the other hand, I've done enough to see the benefits. And one of them,
And that was triggered by this need to slow down a bit. Maybe you can give us some context on? I don't know if you were truly in burnout. I don't think that. You mentioned overwork at one point, right?
yeah, no, there was a period, post first real fundraising where I put a lot of pressure on myself. And at the same time, we made several bad hiring and investment decisions. We started burning a lot of cash. The company's growth began to slow, churn increased, basically all this chaos, even though everything was fine before. And suddenly, despite just raising funds, so everything was fine, then it's total chaos.
That was 10 years ago, a bit less than 10 years ago.
Yeah, it was in 2016. And then indeed, I started working twice as much, but not necessarily well. And so there I was. No longer the best version of myself, at least of an entrepreneur.
And maybe not making the best decisions there.
Oh no, it was full of bad decisions, a lot of personal pressure. In fact, it was the first time I told myself, maybe this actually won't work.
A bit like a computer that doesn't have enough RAM at some point and everything. And so it glitches a bit because there are too many things to manage in parallel.
Exactly. And besides, one of the bad decisions at the time was hiring a sales director who came from our competitor. Because it reassured me to de risk, finally, with a profile that had that experience, but who, in reality, was not at all compatible with our values. And it was a very bad hire that destroyed a huge amount of value for 6 months. So, indeed, I had made a lot of bad decisions back then. And then I had a bit of a wake up call where I realized that it had been 6 months since I'd seen my family, since I'd seen my friends, that I was doing nothing but working and things weren't getting better at the company. And so, indeed, I went looking into meditation for a way to see things more clearly. And actually, everyone thinks that meditation is about emptying your head, when in fact, it's the opposite. It's putting yourself in a posture of observing your thoughts. So that means it's like when you want to change something, the first step isn't to set up an action plan to change it. You want to lose weight, for example? Well, the first step isn't to go on a diet. It's first to write down everything you eat to become aware of what the reality is. And well, actually, meditation,
Your former big guy, huh? Plus, you were 30 or 40 pounds heavier than me.
yeah, exactly. But in your head, you always stay the big guy.
It's true. Once you've been big, you stay. You stay.
But so the first step of meditation is already to take an inventory of your thoughts. And so it has a huge virtue, which is already to realize for a period of, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes to put yourself in this posture of observation and already to say to yourself, okay, what's going through? And afterwards, you can act precisely on the things you want to change. But just doing that already has enormous benefits.
So, meditation for you was this moment of awareness and observation of what's happening to become more clear sighted, about the state of the current situation, to slow down a bit. It's maybe a way. I know you play tennis. Often you realize when you play tennis that if you really look closely at the ball, it slows down. And it's a bit the same feeling. It's telling yourself, I close my eyes, I look at the situation, and already that creates clarity.
Well, there's that, of course. And slowing down time is also appreciating what's happening in the moment. So I don't want to fall into the whole present moment thing. Mindfulness, that everyone talks about. There's a huge amount of bullshit around that. Nevertheless, as an entrepreneur, I was very focused on the results of my company. I had to succeed. So, on the finish line. And after a while, that was kind of destructive because it kept me from taking the right risks. It held me back, in my decisions. And so that's where, thanks to meditation especially, I asked myself, what is the present moment? Well, it's actually appreciating what I do every day. It's trying to shift my focus away from the final results, from the unknown finish line of my company. And so that allowed me to release some of the pressure. And it's the same thing in tennis. When you think too much about the match result, well, you play tentatively, you'll make more mistakes. Whereas if you're focused, you say, okay, point by point,
Yeah,
play the next point,
even shot by shot.
shot by shot.
Yeah,
And my goal isn't even necessarily to win the point, it's to hit the best forehand.
yeah. It's to get the ball back in the court the next time.
Exactly. But you actually start to enjoy what you're doing. And the result is that you won the match, but you're less focused on that. And I think there's that parallel with entrepreneurship. And meditation is a good way to start appreciating exactly what's happening in the present moment.
So, in practical terms, when we say meditation, what kind of practice does that involve?
Oh, well, it's super simple. It's you close your eyes, you breathe in through your nose, you breathe out through your mouth, and that's it.
And you observe the,
And you put yourself in this observational stance, kind of like a river of thoughts that can't stop flowing. So you shouldn't try to stop the flow of the river, but rather look at what the thoughts are.
I organize them. So, I do that and I visualize a circle rather than a river. And in the circle, everything has its place. So, I think of my wife, my family, my mother, and so on. My sister, there's an area, it's right in front on the left. Often there's work. In work, there are actually several parts because it requires several things of me. So I organize them there. And then sometimes there are things from the day, I put them in front. And so it's true that you have this river of thoughts because you have a little LLM, actually a kind of chat GPT in your head that stops, that you can't stop. That's what you were saying there. And you can't tell it. Pause. You always have a thought coming in. And for me, once I've organized them all, it slows down. It's not that there aren't anymore, but those ones are already organized. And that's where, at least for me, it gets interesting. Because then sometimes it'll bring me something new. That I see isn't among the things I often think about. And it teaches you, you say, oh, there's that. It's true, I'm thinking about that again. Maybe it was worrying you. And you realize that you had something you were carrying that was worrying you. Because, well, at least for me, I'm quite visual and all, so I had everything organized on my circle. And then something's brought to me. I say, oh, yeah, there was that. That's true, so I'll put it there. And then there's another thing. After a while, there are fewer things. It slows down, or we do it again. Then I say to myself, I've tidied my room. I've tidied my head. I've tidied my.
Actually, there's another tool that can be the counterpart to meditation that I called a thought download. And so it's another exercise you can do where you set a timer and for 5 minutes, you write down everything that crosses your mind. Actually, that too, well, it's kind of the same thing, but doing it in a more active way. And I think in the age of artificial intelligence, where everyone is fighting to grab a piece of available brain time, knowing how to master your brain and what's happening in it will actually be a strength, a competitive advantage over other humans.
A capacity that people might potentially risk losing a.
Well, I feel like with social media, we're kind of overwhelmed with information all the time. I think my cognitive abilities are decreasing. They'd naturally decrease with age too. But so you have to do exercises to maintain them, just like you do weight training. Actually, earlier we were talking about what the businesses and opportunities of tomorrow might be once most tasks have been replaced. I think back when the world was agricultural, people didn't go to gyms because they were getting exercise by working every day in the fields. They had physical activity. And the day we started having jobs mostly in offices, sitting in front of computers, the gym industry was able to grow because you have to compensate to keep your body healthy. Well, I think in the coming years, we're going to have the equivalent of gyms for the brain
That's a good idea.
because the brain will be used less on a daily basis for work. And so we'll still need to keep it healthy. So there might be gyms where we'll go to do exercises to train our brains.
Cognitive function.
There are a few apps. One that I like, which is Elevate, where you have lots of little exercises in many areas that allow you to train. I think, to circle back to meditation, that when making a decision, sometimes everything gets a bit muddled. There are biases, and, well, doing the meditation exercise by focusing it, by saying, okay, I have to make this decision, then the same process. I close my eyes, I try to organize my thoughts a bit, but more around a subject, and, well, sometimes it brings things out. In any case, I find that this meditation, I put that in quotes because for me, I don't know if it's really, well, yes, it's probably meditation, but it reinforces the intentionality you can have. It'll create clarity for you, reduce the noise, and as a result, you're more intentional because you know why you're doing something. You remove biases, there you go. You increase the intention. Okay, last topic to circle back to what we're doing here. We're recording, we're gonna publish video and audio. You have? It happened to you while creating Zen Chef to speak out, so on Medium several times. And actually, I remember that at the time, there weren't many entrepreneurs who were visible. You were one of the first ones involved. And it's something you did back then, and then you kind of let it go. And now you were telling me you'd recorded quite a few podcasts that you were speaking out, that you were going to help other entrepreneurs. What motivates you today? Even sometimes thinking about creating a media outlet and so on? What brings you here, and why now?
It's true that I saw the impact 10 years ago when I was just telling my entrepreneurial journey in the form of a logbook, in truth, in an unvarnished way, with the failures and all. And that really spoke to people. And I think in the world we live in, everyone tells themselves a story through social media. We show, the best version of our lives. And whether it's now on LinkedIn, it's the same thing. And so I think there's an opportunity today to be authentic. It sounds silly, but just presenting yourself through media, podcasts, or social networks with a message that's authentic, where we don't try to tell our life story as we'd like it to be, but we just try to share our experience in a humble way, thinking it might help others. Well, I think that can obviously have a positive impact, help people, but also be successful in terms of audience, since we trust brands less and less. And today, we're kind of immune exactly to that talk, the fake talk. And we look for the truth, we look for authenticity. So for me, it makes me want to, since it's part of my personality and I've always done it, to do it while reaching the largest audience possible today.
That's super interesting because this decision to be a bit more visible, you could have said today it's necessary. It's part of the business to be visible. But you say, on the one hand, you say there's an opportunity to do it in a certain way. And that's what makes you want to. It's seeing an angle to differentiate yourself, especially through authenticity, which is a funny way to approach it, saying, but actually it's because there's a specific opportunity that I want to do it. And then you say, trust. I really believe in that too. I think today, in a world where there's both a lot of things that are fake on social media, it's what you're saying. A world plus AI, which generates an entirely fake world super easily, we really don't know what's true from what's fake anymore. We have frauds, scams. I feel like every week it's worse between the emails, the BNP, well, for me, my bank, I get fake messages from BNP every 2 seconds. So afterwards, when there's a real message, I don't even dare click anymore. I tell myself, wait, you have to check. We have some at 360 Learning, there were spam campaigns and there's stuff with fake characters like they replace an L with a capital I in emails. You don't see it. You think it's too sophisticated. I don't dare click anywhere anymore. And so in this crisis of trust, you tell yourself that if you can explain to that it's actually necessary to explain to your future clients or your current clients who you are and how you make decisions so they trust you. So they say, okay, I'm engaging with a brand, but behind this brand, there's someone. And I've heard this person speak. I understand how he or she thinks, and so I trust them. And I think that's what you're saying about opportunity. And I think it's a pillar it's a shift in,
Crisis equals opportunity.
yes, what you were saying.
Crisis of trust equals building trust. And what is trust? Being an entrepreneur means putting yourself out there, committing to building a company, and, well, taking a risk. And people follow because they see someone who's willing to take that risk and put themselves out there.
And that's uniquely human for that matter. It's, hey, I can't create that kind of trust with an audience. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Xavier. It's only been 2.5 hours, so it's great. We had a few topics left, so I hope you'll come back for part two.
Yeah, I'll come back in 10 years next time. Thanks.